Cultivation may actually be the mastermind of Roshar, with more complicated aims than we realize. And when she flees Roshar at the end of Wind and Truth, it may be one of the best things that has ever happened to Roshar. So in this video, I'm going to draw back the curtain on Cultivation and walk through why I think she's not always a force for good, and consider that rather than being outmaneuvered by the end of the book, she actually gets everything that she wanted. But if it isn't clear already, this video will include spoilers for all of the Wind and Truth up until the end, along with the rest of the Stormlight archive. So with that, let's get into it. First, I want to do a quick recap of what we know of Cultivation. So Cultivation, aka Corvellium Avast, who is the vessel, is a dragon from Yolen. She's described physically in her dragon form as winged with deep brown skin lined with silver. And prior to holding up and picking up the shard of Cultivation, she was trained as a god, trained essentially to be worshipped. She's kind of a reluctant god of Roshar. She's part of the group that shatters out Nailsium and only ends up settling in Roshar to be with Tanavast, the vessel that used to hold honor. And over the course of the Stormlight archive, she's been presented as kind of an antagonist to Odium, but in like a benevolent, quiet way where she mostly works behind the scenes without kind of overtly or like in a dominant way influencing events that happen on Roshar. So heading into Wind and Truth, we know that she's been influencing or cultivating three characters, Taravangian, Lift, and Dalinar, through granting them a curse and a boon. But that's kind of about the influence that she has explicitly. And so all of this sets her up to be largely like pretty benevolent. But I actually think there are signs that Cultivation's aims are more complex and less benevolent than just being kind of a quiet antagonist to Odium. So the first reason I think that is that Cultivation, you could argue that Cultivation is actually one of the accelerators of conflict on Roshar. I think one of the central messages that is playing out across the Cosmere is that any of the shards devoid of like the balancing influence of the others end up being lopsided and come with drawbacks. And Cultivation here is no different. When Odium confronts her in Wind and Truth, he accuses her, and frankly she all but admits, of letting wars persist because conflict forces growth, not peace. In fact, in Oathbringer, all the way back in Oathbringer, Race, holding Odium 2, says, Cultivation only wants to see transformation, growth. It can be good or bad for all she cares. The pain of men is nothing to her. Second, with the exception of cultivating those three characters that I mentioned earlier, she doesn't actually seem to explicitly work against Odium in a sustained way on Roshar. And we know she can. In fact, I think there's a pretty awesome scene in Wind and Truth where she is ruthless in moving against Kharbran. She undertakes like this tactical precision strike with like individuals in like uniforms and like black masks and sleek black boats to strike Kharbran, to make a point to Odium. And in that scene, they essentially corner Taravangian's daughter and grandchildren, ready to murder them. So she has the capacity to act pretty aggressively, but she chooses not to. And in a conversation she has with Dalinar that I found really instructive at the start of Wind and Truth, he essentially asks her for help, and her response is, I have my own battles. I cannot fight yours. Which I found really interesting, because if defeating Odium on Roshar, which is what Dalinar is trying to do, is not her battle, then what is? So that kind of leads me to my third point, which is her aims might actually be more malevolent than we realize. There's another note that I want to point to where Taravangian perceives the other shards and notes that, interestingly, they consider all three of the gods on Roshar to be a problem, and we're happy to leave them to their conflict. So the other shards also view her as a problem. And then we learn that Town, one of the heralds, tried to kill her. And this is a throwaway line in Wind and Truth, and we learn very little about it. But I don't know about you, Talon is my favorite herald, who's the only one that didn't break, has stayed true to a moral compass. And any enemy of Talon, I feel like, is like enough cause in my mind to at least view with some suspicion. So what does all this mean? And if it's not quite so benevolent, what could be her ultimate aim? So one interpretation, and I think this is like what the book kind of explicitly is leading us towards, is that as she cultivated Taravangian and picked up the shard of odium, she kind of got in over her head. She assumed she could control Taravangian and then couldn't. And so by the end of the book, she ended up fleeing Roshar to hide from Retribution, who's ready to kill her. But I think we can take some of the same information and present a wildly different interpretation, that she's actually this mastermind that manipulated all of the events that play out in Wind and Truth to meet her own ends of 1, escaping Roshar, and yes, 2, weakening odium. So to draw that point out, I want to harken back to what I said at the start of the video, that she was always like somewhat of a reluctant god of Roshar. From Tanavast, he talks about how when they found Roshar, she had actually preferred to find their own lands that don't have creatures of Adonalsium's making, where her and Honor could settle and control. And she ended up only settling on Roshar at Honor's urging. So now that Tanavast, or the Honor that she loves, is dead, she doesn't have a good reason to stay on Roshar anymore. But I think she might actually have been bound to Roshar in quite the same way that odium was. In fact, Tanavast describes how over time, he says, Cultivation had, quote unquote, started to chafe at the binding we performed against odium, even though it was initially her idea. So perhaps I think her ultimate aim would have actually been to unbind odium from Roshar and herself in the process. It's also possible to me that she may have foreseen the creation of Retribution, which I think does end up weakening and mitigating some of odium's worst impulses. And I have a whole video where I walk through that I'll also link to in the description below. But we know from previous books that Cultivation is really good at seeing the future. And so it's possible to me that she did potentially foresee the scenario of odium and Honor combining to form Retribution, and is perfectly happy with that outcome. So what do we think? Is Cultivation a character that's in over her head, who tried to manipulate 3 characters, which then backfired? Or is she a mastermind that actually wanted to unbind odium and wanted the events of Wind and Truth to play out as they did? Or alternatively, is there a third theory that I haven't considered? Please tell me what you think in the comments below. And if you like content like this, please like the video and please subscribe to my channel as I continue to post videos and theories about the Cosmere. Thanks, everyone.